Translation and the Trials of the Foreign by Antoinne Berman. Now, the very title signifies the connection between translation, trials, and the foreign. So, the theorist here is trying to connect translation with the many trials that it has to go through in order to bring the foreign back home. So basically, the entire essay, Berman talks about the different processes or the different concepts that destroy translation. And he also, through that, tells us how to overcome the trials of translating the foreign into your home language. Trial of the foreign is an expression that Heidegger, the German philosopher, first uses to define one pole of a poetic experience. Now, in its own time, this translation was considered a prime manifestation of his madness. Yet today we look at it as one of the great moments of Western translation, not only because it gives us a rare access to the Greek tragic word or language, but it also reveals the masked or the veiled essence of every translation. Now, what does Heidegger mean here by trial of foreign, or what does Berman mean by the trial of foreign when he borrows this phrase from Heidegger? Translation is the trial of the foreign. Now, Berman says that this happens in two senses. In the first place, it establishes a relationship between self-same and the foreign by aiming to open up a foreign work to us in its utter foreignness. Now, this foreignness is one part of the work, and what the translator has to do is to establish a connection between the self and the foreign. In the second place, translation is a trial for the foreign as well, since the foreign work is uprooted from its own language or from its own environment, and it's been transported into a home environment which is foreign for the original text. So this trial often becomes an exile, wherein two texts both has its own foreignness, and the translator is trying to bring the foreign into the self or the same language or the target language. Now here, translation, first and foremost, according to our theorist, means liberating the violence repressed in the work through a series of intensifications in the translation language. Thus, this enhances its foreignness or strangeness. Every work has a set of system involved in it, and when you try to translate those systems into a foreign language, there are so many things that come out into play, and there are certain systems that refuse to be translated, and symbolically a violence is created there. The translator forces the text to be translated. So according to Berman, there involves a violence in that process of translating the untranslatable into the translatable. Michael Foucault distinguishes two methods of translation. In one, something must remain identical and um, given it is given passage into another language. Now, these translations are good when they go from like to same. There are also translations that hurl one language against the other. They tie one language against the other with full violence, taking the original text for a projectile and treating the translation text as a target. So, the first type of translation is a smooth translation, because translation happens from like to same. The untranslatable elements are minimum there. But there are texts wherein uh, the two languages refuse to get translated into each other. And here what happens is one text is thrown at the other. This also corresponds with the later division that came about in the field of translation. Now we have two types of translations happening. One, the literary translations that we are talking about, and two, the non-literary translations, which is technical, scientific, that we see in the advertising area field. Now in the non-literary translations, they perform only a semantic or meaning transfer and deal with the texts that entertain a relation of exteriority and instrumentality to their language. So non-literary translations only care about the meaning being transferred from one language to the other. Whereas the literary translations are concerned with works, that is to say, text, which are so bound to the language that translating act inevitably becomes a manipulation of signifiers, where two languages enter into different forms of collision and violence, and sometimes it gets coupled and gets translated into the other language. Sometimes some part of the translation refuses to get translated and remains untranslated. So literary translation is much more complicated than the non-literary translations. Now, translation is rather a negation of naturalization, as if most individual essence were radically repressed from the source text. Here, the necessity for reflection on the properly ethical aim of translation or translating act becomes important. Which or what is the right way of translation? Is forcible translation possible? Or is violence and repression of meaning in translation good? Or is it called a good translation? So um, these concepts have to be dealt with and talked about. And this brings us to the necessity of such an analysis that Berman puts down here, where he talks about how translation um, can be violent, translation can be smooth at some times, and translation can be repressive. Translation can also become untranslatable. It all depends on the systems that are involved in the language that you're translating from and to. So, therefore, we come to the next concept that Berman talks about, the analytic of translation. Here, he's trying to analyze the different possibilities of translation and the different problems that come up, as we said when we were talking about the untranslatable. So why does this problem happen? Why can't the entire text in all languages be easily translated into the target language? Now, Berman understands that he proposes a provisional analysis based on his experience as a translator from Latin American to French for over a decade now. And he talks about the system of textual deformation that operates in every translation and prevents it from being a trial of the foreign. Now, what do you mean by textual deformation? Textual deformation appears when one text is forced or forcibly translated into another language. Now, Berman says that all texts cannot be translated, or all text in different languages cannot be translated. Only languages that are cultivated can translate. And they're also the ones that put up the strongest resistance to this translation. So he talks to us about the translatology of a language, wherein he says that translation becomes a extension, a dimension of psychoanalysis. Berman feels that all languages and all texts from all languages cannot be translated. Now the focus below will be on the deforming tendencies that we come across in the domain of novel and prose, because Berman gives importance to these two genres here. As we go, he talks to us about 12 deforming tendencies that we see in translations that appear in novels and essays. Now, the 12 tendencies listed here are actually 12 processes that deform or that completely destroys the original text when translated into the target language. The 12 tendencies are rationalization, clarification, expansion, annulment, and popularization, qualitative impoverishment, quantitative in impoverishment, the destruction of rhythms, the destruction of underlying networks of signification, the destruction of linguistic patternings, the destruction of vernacular networks or their exoticization, the destruction of expressions and idioms, and the effacement or the doing away of the superimposition of languages. Now, Berman explains all the 12 different type of deforming tendencies in the following part of the. Let's quickly go through each and every one of it. The first one, rationalization. Now, Berman tells us that giving more importance to punctuation and other syntactical structures of the original. This is one deforming tendency that a translator gets trapped into. Rationalization recomposes sentences and the sequence of sentences, rearranging them according to the idea of a discursive order. Now, rationalization, according to Berman, destroys the shapelessness of the original prose and destroys the polylogism of language. Every language has a logic, it has a rhythm, it has a separate system of syntax, of punctuation. Now, this is completely destroyed when rationally a translator translates a text from the source language into the target language. And what happens here is that rationalization deforms the original by reversing its basic tendencies. So this is one tendency, one process through which the translator kills the original text as he or she translates it into um, the target text. So basically, Berman tells us that the shapelessness of the original prose should be maintained as far as possible into the target language. But again, the problem there is the um, the structure of the source language and the target language are completely different. So how is it possible for a translator to preserve the same shapelessness or the same syntax, the same structure or the same punctuation of the source language into the target language? It's not possible. So this is one um, process, rationalization, that deforms the translated word. Two, clarification. Again, another process. It is um, it's almost like rationalization, wherein in order to be more clear, or clarification becomes an obvious principle to many translators and authors. The translation, according to Galway, an American poet, should be a little clearer than the original. So clarification is inherent in translation to the extent that every translation comprises some degrees of explaining itself. Now, in a negative sense, when you explain something more and more, the clear becomes more faded away, and the translated text becomes less clearer than the original text. So clarification is a positive process, but overdoing clarification reduces its effect and can give a negative sense while translating. Expansion, the opposite. Not the opposite actually, the extension of clarification. So every translation usually tends to be longer than the original. And this is because what happens in translation is translations become inflations of the original. In order to rationalize and clarify, what happens is the original text is expanded. Now, in Berman's viewpoint, this expansion can be qualified as empty. It does not add anything to the original. Content-wise or meaning-wise, this expansion is a complete waste of time and words, because all that the translator is trying to do here is explain, explain, and explain, and try to clarify and try to rationalize what is there in the source text as they translate it into the target text. So the main point here that Berman tells us is that expansion flattens, horizontalizing what is essentially deep and vertical in a novel. So rather than going deeper into the novel or essay while translating, what happens is a translator gets trapped in giving more importance to rationalization and clarifying. Ennoblement. Now this marks a culminating point of classic translation. In poetry, it is poetization, and in prose, it is rhetorization that is given importance. Now, if a translator attempts a poem of example Shelley from English to French, he or she will first spread it out, and then according to the rules of the language, they will insert that, this, which, etc. And thus, what happens is these syntactical barriers weighs down the entire translation, biting into each other. So rhetorization consists in producing elegant sentences while utilizing the source text, so as to speak, as a raw material. This enrollment is only a rewriting, or it is a stylistic exercise, or it provides a certain style to the original text when translated into the target language. Now, ennoblement is positive, but again, like rationalization and clarification, if it is overdone, it creates a sense of um, emptiness in the work, wherein the work is expanded for no reason, or the content is not expanded, it's just the style or the syntax that is expanded. So again, overdone ennoblement can can be can prove negative in translation. The fifth one, qualitative impoverishment. Now here, this refers to the replacement of terms, expressions, and figures in the original language that lack their sonorous or their richness in sound, or signifying or their signifying or iconic richness. Now a term is iconic when, in relation to its referent, it creates an image. Prose and poetry produce in their own peculiar ways what we call a surface of iconicity. Every prose and poetry creates certain images as it has been written or read. Now, this is almost done unconsciously by the reader. Now, what happens here is that these um, expressions and figures are replaced and fixed into the target language. So what happens is that images, words remain the same, meaning remains the same, but the images can differ when translated from one language to another. So Berman says that this effaces away, or it fades away, a good portion of its signifying process and mode of expression. So basically, these are the images that makes a work speak to us. And these very images are taken off when it is translated from the original. So thus, the translated work misses this qualitative content in it. Quantitative impoverishment. Impoverish means something that you lack in. So the fifth point was qualitative impoverishment, and this is quantitative. So qualitative talked about the images that the words make in the mind of a reader, which is untranslatable into the target language. Quantitative impoverishment talks about lexical loss, because in every work you can have thousands of signifiers and signifying chains. And this loss from the original to the target text, wherein many signifying signifier chains are cut off, and what remains are fewer signifiers in the translated text. The translation that attends to the lexical texture of the work, to its mode of lexicality, enlarges it. So what happens here is that the signifier, signified, or signifier signifying chains are reduced or maybe cut off in order for expansion to happen. And instead of these um, signifier signifying chains, they are cut off, and instead of that, articles and prepositions are pushed into the text, into the target language, and translate into target language. And what happens is the translating results in a text that is at once poorer and longer than the original text. So basically, the important um, meaning chains are taken off, the signifier and signifieds are taken off, and in order to fill the gap, more prepositions and articles are pushed in. Automatically, the text becomes longer as we see in expansion. So, rationalization, clarification, and expansion together happens here, and what is produced is a translated work which is poorer than the original text and longer than the original text. Now, this is again one tendency that can completely destroy translation. The destruction of rhythms. Again, the novel is less, even though it is less rhythmic than poetry, it has a rhythm to it. It has many subtle rhythms, which means it comprises a multiplicity of rhythms which are quite subtle in it. It's not as evident as we see in poetry. So, what happens here is that since the entire bulk of the novel is thus in movement, it is difficult for the translation to destroy its rhythmic movement. So, this explains why a great but badly translated novel continues to transport us to another world, because it is difficult. There are so many rhythms involved at different layers of a novel that even if you destroy some of the rhythms, the translation still holds the work together. Now, when compared to a novel, poetry and theatre or dramas are much more fragile. Now, what happens here is that even an arbitrary revision of punctuation can affect the style of the language that we are using when we translate a novel into another language. For example, Faulkner's text, according to Michael Gresset, a very famous translator, tells us that how the translation of Faulkner destroys his distinctive rhythm. When originally there was 4 marks of punctuation in the source text, and the translation uses 22, 18 of which are commas. So you see how expansion occurs here only because of punctuation. But still, the work loses its quality. So destroying the rhythm of the language involved in a novel destroys the um, entire system of the translation that we are doing from one language to another. The destruction of underlying networks of signification. Again, what you see here is a dimension. The literary work contains a hidden dimension, an underlying text. Every work has an underlying text, underlying meaning, or currents of meaning that flows through the text. And that is why we say that you have to read between the lines. And what happens here is that there are certain signifiers which correspond to the different underlying meanings of the text. Now, these subtext, as we call it, if these words or this network of words that we call as subtext, if these words stand alone, they have no meaning. But when these different words come together, a network of meaning, images are produced, signifiers and signifieds are produced. And this set of words and meanings and rhythm, they're all interconnected. So, this simple network shows that signifiers in themselves have no particular meaning, but what makes sense is their linkage. And this is very important dimension of a work. And if a translator misses this dimension of a work, then what results is a literal translation of a text where the meaning of each word has been translated into the target text. And the translator would completely miss out from translating the basic essence of the text. So, these underlying networks of meanings and images and words are to be given importance. And like how Spivak says, the translator has to be sensitive towards this underlying network of words and meanings, which are connected to the culture and the traditions and the lifestyle of the people who speak the source language. So the translator, as Spivak says, has to be completely in love with the text. The translator has to be so sensitive to the underlying meaning of the text, significations of the text, so that after the translation happens, the target text does not lose these networks of signification. Destruction of linguistic patternings, another tendency that happens when a text has been translated into another language. Again, here, as we see, every text has different levels of signifiers and metaphors that happens in a text. Rationalization, clarification, expansion, they all destroy the systematic nature of the text, introducing elements, that makes the text empty. Hence, when the text is translated, or when the translated text is more homogeneous than the original, it is equally more incoherent and in a certain way more heterogeneous and more inconsistent. It's a patchwork of different kinds of writing employed by the translator, as we see in ennoblement. So, pushing in styles, pushing in empty articles and prepositions into the text could give a homogeneous effect to it. But at the end of the day, when we read the translated work, the reader would feel that there is quantity here but no quality. So, homogenization can no more conceal a systematicity than expansion can conceal quantitative impoverishment. So that is a basic point that Berman talks about here. He wants the translators do not try to systematize inconsistency, or the other way around. Also, do not try to you know order the or give another order to the language that you're translating the text into. because every language has its own linguistic patternings. In some languages, consistency is a feature, whereas in other languages, inconsistency is their way of linguistic patterning. So the translator has to be sensitive towards the linguistic patterning of the source language and the target language, so that when translations are done, the translator does not give importance to the words and literal meaning, but the translator gives importance to the patterns that has to be translated, which is difficult but not impossible. So, rationalization or expansion or clarification cannot conceal the quantitative or the qualitative uh, importance of a translated text. The destruction of vernacular networks. Again, just like the linguistic patterning, every text has a vernacular network embedded in it. The theorist calls it as the polylogic aim of a prose. A prose can have polylogic, more than one logic happening in it. It can be the logic of tradition, custom, vernacular, dialect, and all these are equally important for that text. Thus, um, the theorist says that the tendency toward concreteness in text necessarily includes these elements, because the vernacular language is by its very nature more physical, more iconic, which means creates more images than the cultivated language. Now, if you look into the 20th century literatures written in Latin American, Italian, Russian, or North American languages, you can see the vernacular more evident there. But what happens is, unfortunately, the vernacular clings tightly to its soil and completely resists itself in being translated into another language or into another system. Thus, translation can only occur between cultivated languages. These vernacular images are untranslatable. They cannot be translated. If the translator forces them to be translated, the vernacular images lose their effect. So what Berman tries to tell us is that any and every text cannot be translated. Only texts which are written in cultivated languages can be translated. Now, what are cultivated languages? Languages that are standardized, and languages um, wherein the vernacular is cut off, languages wherein the linguistic patterns are made more concrete and uniform. Such languages are called as cultivated languages. So only languages like them can, such languages, translations can happen. The destruction of expressions and idioms. Again, just like how we talked about the destruction of rhythm of a language, linguistic patterning of a language, uh, of how there are many underlying layers of meanings of a text, of the source text. The same way, there are expressions and idioms connected to the customs and traditions and the daily lives of the people involved in the source text. And prose are actually filled with such images and expressions and proverbs and figures, which they derive from the vernacular. Most of them convey a meaning or experience that readily finds a parallel image in other languages. To translate such expressions and idioms is not difficult, but there are other expressions and idioms which resist to get translated, and when translated destroys the essence of those expressions and idioms. Again, one area where the translator gets trapped into. An unsuccessful translation of such expressions and idioms can take away the worth of the translated text. And the last tendency, the effacement of the superimposition of languages. Now, Berman says that every novel is characterized by linguistic superimpositions. They include sociolects, dialects, and he quotes Bakhtin by saying that the novel is a composition or an assembly of heterology, which means diversity of styles, discursive types, heteroglossia, which is a diversity of languages, heterophony, which is a diversity of voices, or polyphony. So every novel is a mixture of different styles, maybe different languages are involved in it, and also obviously different voices are involved in a novel. For example, in Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, when it was translated, there were three different types of French that was mentioned in the translation. You had the French of in the original, both the both the characters, the main characters, they communicate in French. One is a German who talks in French, and the other is a Russian woman who talks in French. And obviously, both these French languages are different. The French spoken by the German and the French spoken by the Russian. So you can see two varieties of French that is turned out and framed when it was translated. So every translator of a novel ought to aspire to be sensitive towards the different voices, the different languages, and the different styles which are involved in a novel. And all these has to be successfully translated into the target language. And Berman says that it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And the example that he gives us is Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain. Thus, Berman tells us that the analytic of translation must be carefully distinguished from the study of norms, which is the literary, social, or culture. He says that what a translator has to study is not the literary, social, cultural traditions of the source text, but what the translator has to be sensitive towards are the different layers of patterns, linguistic patterns, or maybe syntactical patterns or semantical patterns that he or she finds in the original text that has to be successfully translated into the target language. And even though it can happen that at some point of time there can happen a conflict when certain expressions and certain patternings are translated from the source language to the target language, Berman says that if these 12 tendencies are known to the translator, he or she can avoid such tendencies and create less violence to translate the untranslatable. And Berman also tells us that every language cannot be translated. A text in every language cannot be translated into another language. Only cultivated languages can be used in translation. Thus, Berman concludes by telling us that the problem is knowing whether this is unique and ultimate task of translation or whether its task is something else again. So the first thing the translator has to know is what is the problem, or what are the problems that are involved in translation. Literal translation should be something that a translator should aspire towards. Now, literal means attached to the letter or the work. Labor on the letter in translation is more originary than the reconstitution of meaning. So, more than the meaning, what the translator has to be sensitive towards is the words or the letter or the work itself. The entire work, which means the different underlying patterns that run across the work. So, word to word translation is no longer accepted as a good translation. It is through this labor that translation restores the particular signifying process of work, which is more than their meaning, and on the other hand, transforms the translating language. So, two things are to happen in translation. A good translation must translate the entire signifying process of the source text into the target language, one, and two, the target language or the translating language should be transformed or enriched at the end of the translation. So if these two things can successfully happen, then that is a good piece of translation. So the target language has to be enriched and transformed after a translation is done. And two, if at all a translation has to be done, then it is the signifying systems that has to be translated from one language to another and not the mere word meaning. Thus, in every translation, the source language and the target language has to be modified in one way or the other. If this modification or enrichment happens, then that is a successful translation. This is exactly what Surjit Mukherjee or maybe Spivak tells us, that in every translation the target language has to get something from that translation. So consequently, the essential aim of the analytic of translation is to highlight this other essence of translating. So what is the essence of translating? It is that one, signifying processes and systems are to be translated rather than the literal meaning of the word, and two, both the foreignness of the source text has to be, all the foreign elements of the source text has to be translated into the target language, and the target language has to get modified after each and every translation. If this happens, then according to Berman, that is the trial of the foreign. The trial, the translator wins the trial, wherein the foreignness of the source text and the source language is being successfully imported without cutting it off, without changing it, without hampering it into the target language. And the target language gets modified because of these foreign elements from the source language. So It's an entire complicated process. So literary translation is not as easy as the non-literary translation. Literary translation involves a whole lot of process, and at the end you get a good translation.